First up is Elemental, which is the latest animated film from Pixar, and I have such a soft spot in my heart for Pixar animated films. I think most of us do, and it makes it really hard because you end up comparing them to all of the other films that the studio has made, and that can sometimes work to the detriment of some of the individual films, because when the track record is as strong as it is, if you are anything less than revolutionary, you fall into the middle or the lower end of the pantheon. And unfortunately for me, that is where Elemental tends to fall. That's not to say it's a bad movie, because again, this is sort of the curse of their own success. If a different studio or an indie, production company had put this out, everyone would be like, oh my God, wow, look what they accomplished, all these things. But because the expectations are so high, and because that this studio is capable, and the creatives and everyone like that are capable of putting out something like an Inside Out, an Up, a WALL-E, a Finding Nemo, it's just a little, it's unfair in some senses, but you also have to look at it, all right, what is this movie like on its own? And I think Elemental is a perfectly cute, fine, pleasant movie. It's not gonna, shift a paradigm or change the way you think about feelings or, make you absolutely fall in love with a robot or whatever it is. It's not gonna accomplish that. But it's a perfectly pleasant viewing experience. It's from director Pete Sohn, and it's very clearly inspired by, he's been very vocal about, it's clearly inspired by, an immigrant experience, and for him in New York City. And it centers around these two characters, Ember and Wade. Ember is made of fire, Wade is made of water. It's clearly an allegory for, race, and there's a lot of socioeconomic and racial and a little bit of gendered commentary in it. But the problem with it is that it's actually just too on the nose for me. Like, I feel like it's just so kind of obvious what they're trying to get across, and they don't trust the audience enough to be like, hey, you can actually use, critical thinking and make extra leaps, which is something that Inside Out was able to do and had a little more depth to it versus the literal like, oh, they are fire and water. They are not meant to mix. Well, like, no, duh. Okay. Again, it's trying to tackle a lot of very complicated concepts, but it simplifies them down so much that I think it loses something in it. I do really like that they ended up with voice actors who are voice actors. I mean, they're also actors, but they didn't stunt cast it necessarily. They actually picked people who maybe aren't huge names, but did bring a lot to the performances. Leah Lewis is Ember, Mamoudou Athie is Wade, and then some of the rest of the voice cast includes Wendi McLendon-Covey, Catherine O'Hara, Sheila Ami, Ronnie Carmen, who's actually a story artist and director over at Pixar, but he voices the dad of Ember, which is fun. So yeah, again, this is a perfectly pleasant movie. It moves along quickly. It's very beautiful. Some of the effects are very cool, but it is, as an adult, very on the nose. And there are things that, especially if you do come from any sort of, immigrant-related family, whether you are an immigrant yourself, whether you're the child of immigrants, etc., you will immediately recognize a lot of the things involved in it, which is really nice to have that represented on screen. I just wish it was a more complex representation of it, because I do think it's worth portraying these stories in a more well-rounded way, so they don't always get distilled down to this. It's like, oh, people will only relate to this if we bring it back to literally the elements. Like, we can deal with a little bit more than that. And again, the other thing I will say about this is this movie does also get bogged down in a lot of, not adult is absolutely the wrong word, but sort of like mature complexities that I don't know if little kids will necessarily relate to. Like, there's a bunch of stuff about safety codes and like violations and, ticket filing and all of this stuff that I was just like, this is kind of a weird, adventure in this thing. And I actually thought some of those plots were going to go in different directions. I thought there was going to be maybe like a further environmental story to it, since they are all elements and things like that. But it didn't. It just sort of stopped in its tracks. Again, I think they were trying to not overcomplicate it. But I came out of it wanting just something a little bit more out of the film, which is kind of a bummer. But again, I think if you temper your expectations going into it, it'll be totally worth watching. And also, if you have little kids, like, this is what you're seeing this weekend. No questions asked, This is absolutely the film you're going to see, especially compared to the other ones I'm going to talk about. But overall, I'm going to give it a 3.8 out of 5. The next film I have this week is The Flash, and this one is going to be really challenging to review for a variety of reasons. So the first of which being, there's this sort of elephant in the room of the star of The Flash is Ezra Miller, and he is going through something right now, medical or not. I'm not a doctor. I don't know what's going on there, but there are issues that have arisen out of it that even if it is a mental health issue, it's not excusable for it. It's attributable to it potentially, but either way, he's an aggressively complicating factor to the film. Like, there is no denying that, which ironically is too bad because he's pretty good in this movie. And so it made it hard as an audience member, for me at least, to sit there and go like, I'm kind of enjoying your performance here, but I also know that you've not done some great things lately. So I acknowledge that, like, for a lot of us going into it, that is going to be a factor, and it's a question of whether or not you support this film, right? Because you are effectively with your wallet, maybe you're not validating his behavior by going to see it, but you're not proactively sending a message against it, in a sense. Again, it's complicated, and there are so many people involved in making a film that it's like, oh, do you punish all of them just because the star of the film is doing whatever, is involved in whatever? So that was a huge factor for me in seeing this film. Then there are a couple other factors. Trying to take that part out of it and just be like, all right, let's try and evaluate this as just a film and not, look at through the lens of the lead is, whoever the lead is. So I'm going to say, first of all, the CGI in this film is atrocious. And I say this with respect to artists, and I know how hard it is, but some of the things in this movie are just... Some of them are active decisions that I'm like, who allowed this to happen? Whose design aesthetic? Who was like, yes, this is a good idea. We should make these people look this way. And, this looks fine. Like, we don't need it to be realistic, et cetera, et cetera. It was so distracting in so many points. I was just like, CGI has come so far. How is this still being allowed to happen? But then let's get to the main reason that I think a lot of people are going to want to see this film, and that is the return of Michael Keaton as Batman. And I'm not a huge DC person. I think I like the old school Batman movies the best out of all of them. I love Wonder Woman, but, seeing all the other DC films leading into this, I was just kind of like, I am not super excited for this. It's going to be whatever. But a ton of people I talked to who got a chance to see it before me were so excited. And that is because they are Michael Keaton Batman people. And I was like, you know what? More power to you. Like, I hope you enjoy this film. I don't ever want to take something away from someone, but for me, it didn't necessarily, that wasn't as much of a drawing factor for it, but it was more of a curiosity. Now, was Michael Keaton great in this film? Yeah. He was pretty great in this film. He was having a good time, clearly. He did not seem to have a problem with returning to it. He looks great, There are some stunts that I was like, this Batman at this point should be, like, relatively older. Like, are we really trying to play off that he could still do this with this much ease? Okay, fine, no problem. But still, he was great. The score for this movie, I will also say, is fantastic. It was amazing. And, when the old school Danny Elfman Batman score came in, I was like, ooh, okay. This part's getting me in. This is getting me in the nostalgia, and I will give you credit where credit is due. Is it absolute fan service, and is it absolute fan service and potentially like I'm going to say cheap ploy in order to help gloss over some of the other major glaring issues in this film? Yeah, it is. Did it work? Yeah, it kind of did. The other huge person in this film is Supergirl, played by Sasha, and she's fine in this. I feel like just the character itself was aggressively underutilized. The whole point of The Flash, sorry, I should go back to that, is it's basically Flashpoint, and if you are familiar with that comic thing, it's Barry basically, like, it's a multiverse story, and so Barry, or Ezra Miller, the Flash, ends up in a different timeline by trying to... He runs so fast that he can go back in time, but then we all know that if you go back in time, it's going to mess things up. So that is how we end up in a universe where we get a Michael Keaton Batman, etc. I don't think that's a spoiler because it's been in all the trailers, and, it's very obvious what's going to happen. Again, Ezra Miller in this, I have to say, is pretty good. He gets to play multiple timelines of himself, and he's decent at differentiating between it. I was like, there's a reason that Ezra Miller was cast. He is a good actor in spite of, Ezra Miller, the actor, is a good actor. Ezra Miller, the person, is the, whatever. We're not talking about that anymore. We are talking about it, but I have said my bit about that. Like I said, the film is nonsensical. The dialogue is questionable at points. I don't hate the way that they've explained multiverses in this. Multiverses in general are like a really hard thing to deal with. Look at Marvel. Look at anybody. Look at Star Trek. Look at anybody trying to do these type of convergence timelines. It's not easy. I think they explain it in a way that is palatable. And I was like, you know what? They're just saying, hey, here's what we're gonna go with and move on. And it was done in a way that I was like, I'm willing to move on. So to wrap this up, if you are a huge Batman fan, a huge Michael Keaton Batman fan, you're going to go see this anyway. If you are a huge DC Universe fan, you're going to go see this anyway. And you're going to get a lot of Easter eggs and you're going to have a great time. And I don't begrudge anybody who's going to see this film because of those reasons. I had a better time than I was expecting. It was really overhyped for me. You know, some people are saying it's the best DCU film to date, etc., etc. I don't know if that's exactly true, but it was a lot better than I personally was expecting. Again, given all the baggage bringing into it, I think I just ended up being willing to go along for the ride because part of it was helped by the fact that, you know, the DC universe is basically being reset at this point, and so I don't need to know what happens after this. It's just sort of like, cool. I actually don't think at the end of it I would have hated getting to follow this story along. Batman versus Superman, all that stuff, like, I just haven't been invested in what goes on in those universes, but this I was like, oh, there's enough of like a human or human, superhuman, whatever you want to call it, element that I wouldn't have hated figuring out what's going on here, and it was a clever way to sort of bring in characters who we might have more of an affinity for versus the sort of new folks they built, but because there are all the shifts happening on that front, knowing that, you know what, it's probably not going to go anywhere, it was actually a little bit liberating to be like, I don't have to invest too much in it. I can just sort of disconnect and watch the film. So like I said, huge DC fans, like, you're going to have a great time. There's going to be a ton of Easter eggs. If you were on the fence, and particularly on the fence because of Ezra Miller, I'm not going to say this was so spectacular that you absolutely have to see this. If that wasn't a problem for you and you're like on the fence, I'd be like, you know what, you might, and you were already, you know, you like comic book movies, things like that, I will say you will actually probably have an okay time as long as you know that there are just ridiculous things about it. You know, there's a campiness to it that is something I actually enjoy in a lot of superhero films. So all of that being said, those are the various factors to consider when you're going to go see The Flash. I personally am going to give it a 3 out of 5. And then my last film this week is called Extraction 2, and it is the sequel to the first Extraction film, which is a Netflix original. This is also a Netflix original film. It stars Chris Hemsworth as a basically like not superpowered super soldier character. I remember only one thing about the original Extraction film, and that one came out in 2020, and that's an important thing to talk about. So the only thing I remember about the original Extraction is that there's a big helicopter fight at the end of it, and the memory I have of it is just, oh, okay, they spent all their money and all of their plot building to this big helicopter fight. And that was the only thing I took away from it. I did not rewatch it going into this. The thing about the Extraction films is that, you know, the Russo brothers produced them, Joe Russo wrote them. The important thing about the first Extraction film is that it came out in mid-April or like late April of 2020, and at the time, we were just enough into the pandemic that there was nothing new coming out except for some of these Netflix films. And so I was just like, yes, new film. I am so excited. Hooray. Thank goodness. And even then, I didn't love it. And I went back and I listened to my review of it. And I think now looking back at it, I was probably overly generous, but the desperation inflated the score. And it's very funny because some of the key points of that review are absolutely applicable to Extraction 2. A lot of it feels like a video game, like a video game sort of cinematography. And this is not to, knock video games and video game cinematography. I love video games. I feel like it's almost insulting to video games to compare this. There's an emotional acting scene that happens so late in the film. And this is applicable to the first one and the second one, where I think they went, oh yeah, we have to have some sort of plot. But literally in Extraction 2, this is not a spoiler, but it comes in 90 minutes into the movie. That is, 90 minutes is a full movie's runtime. So they have a full movie occur, and that's being generous. And then they're like, oh yeah, we should add some emotional stakes to this, or like additional emotional stakes. I'm just like, how? How did you think that this was okay? Like, and your audience was gonna, come along for the ride? It's I almost could probably give the same review for both of them. Chris Hemsworth is beautiful to look at. I actually think he's very funny. I think he is not necessarily the right person for this role because he's being super serious, but then he's trying to be a little bit quippy, and it's not reading in a way that I think they want to. Like I said, I didn't rewatch the first one going into this. I don't think you need to. All you need to know is that he's a soldier, and they're going to tell you exactly what's about to happen, and then they're going to tell you a lot of things, and they're going to narrate the action. This is a really big pet peeve of mine, and more movies have been doing this recently, where it's sort of they narrate the action that is happening, and then they show you the action that's going to happen, or that, the person is described. There was a Guy Ritchie movie recently with Jason Statham, and it did the exact same thing, and everyone's on walkie-talkies, and they're like, there's going to be a bogey on your left, and then you see the bogey on the left. It's like, why not just show me the bogey on the left? It's not like telling me this ahead of time is building the anticipation or adding to the suspense. Anyway, no, it's not good. It is not good at all. I think the biggest compliment I can give it is that my big note for the first one is that the sound mix was really weird. It would go from really quiet and then like loud shooting. This one, they sort of fixed that. It's a bit odd because there's no music in a lot of it, and I know they're trying to do that to be tense, but then that I actually think exacerbates some of the video game feel of it. And I'm not saying this as a rude comparison. Video games, I think, do this better than Extraction 2 did. They could take a page out of any sort of game's playbook. The other new factor in this one, the last one had David Harbour. This one has Idris Elba for, I didn't even count. I could probably go back and count. I'm not going to. Maybe 2 minutes of time, and to him I say, good for you for getting that payday, or maybe doing a favor for the Marvel universe that has moved over to Netflix. But yep, Idris Elba's in it, but overall, it's super predictable. There's no brain power involved at all in it. I didn't particularly enjoy it. It's not the type of thing I mean, I could have it on the background and still follow along and not care. It's just a little bit loud for me. But if you like action movies and you just want one for the background, that's totally fine. Otherwise, I'm going to say this is totally skippable. I'm going to give it a 1.8 out of 5. I almost want to go back and give the other one, adjust the score. But at the time, it did something that I needed very much, and that it gave me new content. This one is just recycled of that, and now we have other movies coming out, so it has no excuse. That's Extraction 2, 1.8 out of 5.